Reid's life had always been a series of carefully plotted coordinates. Early mornings, the same lukewarm coffee, the drone of the city outside his third-story apartment window, then the predictable click-clack of his keyboard in the accounting firm. Numbers, ledgers, the comforting certainty of balanced equations. He wasn't unhappy, not exactly, but he often felt like a cog in a machine that was perpetually humming, never quite roaring to life. His days bled into weeks, weeks into months, each one a carbon copy of the last, distinguished only by the slow crawl of the calendar. Then came the call. Not a digital ping or an email, but an actual, old-fashioned phone call that snagged him mid-spreadsheet. The voice on the other end was clipped, formal, belonging to a solicitor he'd never heard of. A solicitor representing an estate he certainly didn't recognize. The name mentioned, however, sent a faint tremor through him. A great-aunt, twice removed, a woman Reid dimly recalled his mother mentioning once or twice, a phantom relative relegated to dusty photo albums and hushed whispers. He remembered something about him being eccentric, reclusive, maybe even a bit touched. The solicitor's words, delivered with the practiced ease of one accustomed to delivering unwelcome news, outlined a sudden passing, a solitary existence, and then, the unexpected twist, Reid was the sole beneficiary. An inheritance. Not money, not property in a bustling city, but a cabin. A secluded, ancient cabin, deep within a forgotten forest. The solicitor's tone held a subtle, almost imperceptible note of something beyond professional detachment when he described its location, a place so remote it barely registered on modern maps. Reid hung up, the receiver heavy in his hand, the comfortable hum of his office suddenly discordant. A cabin. In a forgotten forest. It sounded less like an inheritance and more like the opening line of a cautionary tale. He knew nothing of this relative, nothing of this cabin, yet a strange pull, an undeniable curiosity, began to unfurl within him, loosening the tightly wound strings of his predictable existence. He felt a sudden, profound desire to see this place, to understand why he, of all people, had been chosen. Within a week, the spreadsheets were handed over, his apartment lease terminated, and a small, carefully packed bag sat beside him in his aging sedan. The city lights receded in his rearview mirror, replaced by sprawling suburbs, then small towns, and finally, long, empty stretches of highway. The air grew cooler, crisper, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. He tracked the directions the solicitor had provided, a cryptic set of landmarks rather than precise GPS coordinates. The roads narrowed, pavement giving way to gravel, then to little more than twin ruts carved through encroaching foliage. He passed a border checkpoint, a solitary wooden booth manned by a uniformed officer whose face was obscured by the shadows beneath his cap. The officer barely glanced at Reid's identification, his eyes lingering for a moment on the car's dusty exterior, then waving him through with a weary flick of his wrist. It felt less like crossing a state line and more like crossing into another time, another world. The last vestige of the familiar slipped away behind him, swallowed by the dense canopy. The trees grew taller, thicker, their branches interlacing overhead, filtering the sunlight into shifting patterns of gloom and stark brightness. A subtle unease began to prickle at the back of his neck. This wasn't just remote, it was isolated. Utterly, completely cut off. Finally, after consulting the hand-drawn map for the 10th time, he spotted it, a faint, overgrown track veering off the main path. He turned, the car protesting with a groan, and pushed deeper into the woods. The track ended abruptly in a small, circular clearing, choked with weeds and saplings. And there it was. The cabin. It sat hunched beneath a canopy of ancient oaks, their gnarled limbs reaching like skeletal fingers. The structure itself was a study in decay, its weathered timber walls a mosaic of greens and grays, encrusted with moss and lichen. The roof sagged in places, a patchwork of rotting shingles, and the single stone chimney seemed to list precariously. No smoke curled from it. No welcoming light shone from its grimy windows. It looked less like a dwelling and more like something that had clawed its way out of the earth itself, rooted deep in the forgotten soil. He killed the engine, and the sudden cessation of noise was jarring, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves and the distant murmur of something unseen. The air tasted of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something metallic and faintly acrid, like old iron and forgotten secrets. He stepped out of the car, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, damp ground. A single, rickety porch step groaned under his weight as he approached. He reached for the wooden door, its surface rough and splintered beneath his fingers, and pushed. It didn't budge. A heavy, rusted padlock clung to a thick, iron hasp. As he inserted it into the lock, a shiver ran through him, a premonition of something vast and unknown stirring beneath the cabin's silent exterior. He felt an undeniable sense of being watched, not by an animal, but by the very stones and timbers of the place. This was more than just a cabin, it was a threshold. And he had just stepped across it. The mundane world, his ordered life of numbers and ledgers, felt impossibly distant, a forgotten dream. Here, in the encroaching gloom, a different kind of calculation was beginning. The solicitor's crisp voice still echoed in Reid's mind, a stark counterpoint to the drone of the old engine as he drove deeper into the wilderness. Beyond that arbitrary line, the paved road had dissolved into a gravel track, then into a barely discernible trail swallowed by an encroaching forest. The trees here were different, taller, older, their branches interwoven like gnarled fingers, blocking out the sky. He found the cabin just as dusk began to bleed purple into the horizon. It wasn't merely old, it felt ancient, a hunkered-down beast of dark, weathered timber and moss-covered stone. Windows, small and grimy, stared out like vacant eyes. A rusted iron gate, half off its hinges, marked the entrance to a narrow, overgrown path that led to the front door. He killed the engine, and the sudden quiet was profound, almost deafening. A shiver, unrelated to the cooling air, traced its way down his spine. A single shaft of weak, late afternoon light pierced a window, illuminating an army of dust motes dancing in the gloom. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight with every step, a symphony of complaint. Cobwebs draped every surface, shimmering like forgotten lace. Reid moved through the rooms, pulling back heavy, moth-eaten curtains, letting in more of the fading light. Everything was covered in a fine, powdery layer of neglect. He spent the first few hours methodically cleaning, driven by a need to impose order on the chaos. He swept away decades of dust, scrubbed at grimy surfaces, and wrestled open stiff windows, desperate for fresh air. The work was physical, grounding, and for a while, it pushed away the unsettling quiet. It began subtly. A soft thump from upstairs, like a heavy book falling. He continued sweeping, but a moment later, a distinct scrape echoed from the kitchen. He walked in, broom still upright, scanning the small, dim space. Nothing. A chair, perhaps, had shifted on its worn wooden legs. He spun around, but the hallway was empty, swallowed by the candlelight's reach. He blinked, rubbing his eyes. Too many hours on the road, he rationalized, reaching for a dented pot. His movements were a little sharper now, a little less fluid. He decided to make a fire in the hearth. As he bent to arrange kindling, he noticed a small, tarnished silver locket lying on the rough stone mantelpiece. He was certain it hadn't been there earlier. He picked it up. It was heavy, cool to the touch, intricately engraved with a swirling, unfamiliar symbol. When he tried to open it, the clasp was jammed, refusing to yield. He set it back down, a prickle of unease starting to bloom in his chest. I must have missed it, he thought, but the conviction felt thin, fragile. Sleep didn't come easily. He lay on the cot, listening. A faint, rhythmic tap-tap-tap started somewhere in the wall beside his head. He squeezed his eyes shut. When he woke, the room was still dim, caught in the gray-mauve pre-dawn. He pushed himself up, feeling stiff and unrest. He shuffled into the main living area, intending to stoke the dying embers of the fire. That's when he saw it. On the small, dust-caked writing desk in the corner, a leather-bound journal lay open. Its pages were brittle and yellowed, filled with cramped, faded script. He remembered seeing the desk, but the journal hadn't been there. He hadn't touched it, hadn't even noticed it among the clutter he'd started to organize. A knot tightened in his stomach. This wasn't the wind, or the house settling. This wasn't fatigue playing tricks. Someone, or something, had placed it there. He approached cautiously, his breath catching in his throat. The journal lay open to a page filled with dense writing, and a small, crudely drawn symbol at the bottom, identical to the one on the locket he'd found. Sacrifices. The forest claims its due. Reid stared, his mind racing, trying to find a rational explanation, but none came. He wasn't alone here. And whatever was here, it was starting to make itself known. The cold dread that had bloomed in Reid's stomach refused to dissipate. It was a physical weight, settling deep, a constant thrum beneath his ribs. Yet, the cabin pushed back against his rationalizations with an insidious persistence. The following days became a blur of escalating unease. The subtle shifts began to sharpen, becoming undeniable. He would wake to the faint, metallic scent of old blood, a smell that clung to the air like a shroud, only to vanish moments later, leaving him gasping in the empty bedroom. One evening, while trying to read by the hearth, a hefty volume on local flora slid off the mantelpiece, landing with a jarring thud at his feet. There was no tremor, no vibration, nothing to explain its sudden descent. Reid stared at the book, then at the mantel, a thin film of sweat breaking out on his forehead. He found himself constantly checking the locks, peering out windows into the dense, encroaching forest, his gaze snagging on the ancient, gnarled trees that seemed to lean in, watching. Sleep became a fractured thing, punctuated by vivid, disorienting dreams of muddy earth, skeletal hands reaching from beneath the floorboards, and a low, guttural chanting that echoed in his ears long after he jolted awake. He was no longer just tired, he was unraveling. The cabin was a cage, and something unseen was rattling its bars. He needed answers. He needed to know about this place, about the distant relative who had left it to him, about the land itself. His research began in the cabin's small, neglected library. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating shelves packed with antiquated texts. He pulled down dusty local histories, old gazetteers, and even a few yellowed journals belonging to previous occupants. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and dry rot. He spent hours poring over brittle pages, his fingers stained with grime, cross-referencing names and dates, searching for any mention of his relative's lineage or the specific plot of land the cabin occupied. He found scattered references to the area's early settlers, the indigenous tribes who had once roamed these woods, and the gradual encroachment of European colonialists. He learned of small, forgotten skirmishes and isolated homesteads that had been abandoned without explanation. But nothing about his family, not specifically, and nothing about the cabin's immediate surroundings that felt truly significant. The frustration mounted. The cabin felt older than any records suggested, its timbers imbued with a presence that spoke of deeper roots. Reid began to suspect the information he needed lay beyond these dusty walls, perhaps in a regional archive or a historical society further afield. He marked a few promising leads, an old county deed office mentioned in a 100-year-old almanac, and a university library known for its rare local manuscripts. Both were located in a neighboring province, a day's drive away. The journey was tedious. Eventually, he reached the regional boundary. The formality felt absurd given the quiet desolation of the road, but Reid appreciated the momentary return to something resembling normalcy. After another hour of driving, he arrived at the county deed office. It was a low, brick building, its interior smelling faintly of stale coffee and industrial cleaner. An elderly clerk, her spectacles perched on her nose, helped him navigate the labyrinthine records. Reid explained his inheritance, his desire to trace the cabin's lineage. He spent the better part of the afternoon sifting through microfiche, squinting at blurry copies of ancient land grants and property transfers. Then, he found it. Not a deed, not a clear transfer, but a faded, almost illegible document dating back nearly 2 centuries. It wasn't a standard purchase agreement. It was titled Covenant of Allocation. His relative's name wasn't on it, nor any direct ancestor he recognized. Instead, it bore the signature of a colonial surveyor and several other individuals, their names obscured by time. What stood out, however, was the description of the land. It wasn't about ownership in the traditional sense. It was about allocation, about terms. The document spoke of the land not as property, but as something requiring constant watch, a burden, a sacred or profane trust. This wasn't just land. This was a pact. And his family, it seemed, had been part of it for generations. The cabin, the forest, the eerie phenomena, they weren't random. They were connected to this ancient, unsettling agreement. Reid copied the document, his hands trembling slightly, the mundane act feeling like he was sealing his own fate. He wasn't just alone in the cabin, he was trapped within a history he was only just beginning to comprehend. The archaic language of the microfiche had burrowed into Reid's mind, a persistent, chilling whisper. Allocation, terms, enduring vigilance, the words coiled around him, tightening with each passing hour. This wasn't merely about property. It was about an obligation, a debt, something far older and more sinister than a simple will. He felt the cabin's oppressive weight, a palpable presence that had shifted from mere unease to a suffocating dread. He needed answers, and the dusty, isolated cabin wasn't giving them up easily. He had to leave, if only for a few hours, to find a larger archive, a proper library, somewhere with more than just his distant relative's cryptic papers. He gathered his minimal supplies, the simple act of packing feeling like an escape plan. Ahead, a weathered wooden booth stood sentinel, a faded barrier pole slanting across the road. This was the border checkpoint, a relic from a forgotten time, marking the true edge of the wilderness. He slowed, pulling to a stop beside the booth. A figure emerged, an old man with skin like dried leather and eyes that held the deep, knowing stillness of the forest itself. He wore a threadbare uniform, its insignia long since faded beyond recognition. The border guard, or whatever he was, peered into Reid's window, his gaze unsettlingly direct. "Leaving so soon?" the guard rasped, his voice gravelly, like stones shifting in a dry riverbed. He didn't ask for ID, didn't check the vehicle. His eyes simply fixed on Reid. "Just for some supplies," Reid lied, the words feeling thin and transparent in the heavy air. The old man nodded slowly, a slow, deliberate movement. "You're the new one, then?" "From the old place." It wasn't a question. "Reid." "They always come back," the guard murmured, his gaze drifting past Reid. Towards the cabin's direction, lost in the distant tree line. "The family." "To the land." "But the land. It remembers. It always asks for its due." He turned back to Reid, his eyes holding a surprising intensity. "Always has. Best to know what you're dealing with, boy. It's always hidden, but always found." The guard merely straightened, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. "Some things are best faced with open eyes, boy. Drive safe." He waved a hand, and the barrier pole slowly creaked upwards. Reid drove through, his mind reeling. The ledger of the earth. Terms. Lineage. The old man's words echoed the microfiche, solidifying the terrifying implication. He didn't go to the library. He turned around. The cabin was calling his back, and now he knew why. Back in the cabin, the air felt thicker, heavier, as if the walls themselves were listening. The silence was no longer empty, it was pregnant with expectation. He started his search, systematically, his determination overriding the rising fear. He scoured the study, the room where he'd found the microfiche, the place where the relative had spent his final, tormented days. He checked the bookshelves, pulling out volumes, running his hand along the back of the shelves. Then, behind a thick, dusty tome on local history, his fingers snagged on something. A faint groove, almost invisible, running vertically along the back panel of the shelf. He pressed, pushed, pulled. Inside, nestled amongst cobwebs and dried leaves, was a book. There were no titles, no ornamentation, just the raw, tactile presence of something ancient. This had to be it. The Ledger of the Earth. Reid pulled it out, his fingers trembling. He carried it to the heavy oak desk, the very desk where his relative had likely sat, perhaps staring at these same pages. He opened it. The pages were thick, parchment-like, filled with an elegant, spidery script, different from the microfiche, yet equally archaic. Dates were meticulously recorded, stretching back centuries. Terms agreed. Vigilance to be maintained. Year of the green sickness, renewal of the pact. The steward's blood, a binding agent. The land accepts its due. Year of the endless winter, the offering prepared. To ensure the prosperity of the lineage, the entity must be sated. Enduring vigilance. The words blurred before Reid's eyes, yet their meaning coalesced into a horrifying clarity. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal pact. His family, his lineage, had made a deal, generations ago, with something tied to this very land. And the enduring vigilance wasn't a warning, It was a condition. A condition that required sacrifice. The entity wasn't just in the cabin, it was the land, demanding its gruesome tithe. The relative hadn't simply died, he had been part of this grim ledger, a link in a chain that now, Reid realized with a sickening lurch, had reached him. The parchment, brittle beneath his fingers, had delivered its chilling pronouncement. A pact. Generations of his lineage, bound by ink and blood to the very soil beneath this cabin. Reid's breath hitched, a thin, reedy sound in the sudden, crushing silence. He wasn't just an heir to a property, he was an heir to a burden, a watchful servitude to something he couldn't yet comprehend. The familiar creak of floorboards above became the deliberate shift of weight. A low hum vibrated through the wooden walls, a frequency that seemed to bypass his ears and settle directly in his teeth. Reid felt a tremor deep in his chest, an internal quake that mirrored the cabin's subtle, unnerving pulse. But the floorboards groaned again, a protracted, drawn-out sound directly over his head, as if a great, unseen weight was being dragged across the attic. He stared at the ceiling, a knot tightening in his stomach. He'd explored the attic. It was empty save for dust and forgotten trunks. There was nothing up there heavy enough to make that sound. Nothing human. He glanced down, expecting to see a gap in the floor, but the planks were seamless. It wasn't just the cabin. Anymore, it was in the cabin, and it was aware of him. Now. He didn't know what enduring vigilance meant for him, but he knew he didn't want to find out while trapped within these walls. He snatched his vehicle keys from the hook by the door, his hand shaking so violently the metal jingled. He grabbed a small backpack, shoving his wallet and phone inside, his mind racing, a single thought hammering: escape. He practically fell into his vehicle, fumbling the key into the ignition. He jammed the shifter into reverse, gravel spitting as he backed out, then spun the wheel, desperate to put distance between himself and the cabin. The dirt track leading out of the forest, usually a winding path of potholes and overgrown foliage, seemed different. The trees pressed closer, their branches forming a dense, skeletal canopy overhead, blocking out the last vestiges of twilight. Just as a sliver of hope began to unfurl in his chest, a flicker of light pierced the gloom ahead. Civilization. A town. Salvation. As he drew closer, the lights resolved into a structure, low and squat, bathed in a sickly yellow glow. It wasn't a gas station or a roadside diner. It was a concrete barrier, a small, abandoned building with a corrugated metal roof, and a heavy, rusted boom arm stretched across the road. A sign, faded and pockmarked, was barely legible: border checkpoint. Reid slammed on the brakes, the vehicle skidding to a halt. A border checkpoint? Here? In the middle of an ancient, forgotten forest, miles from any actual border? The building was clearly derelict, windows boarded up, paint peeling from its concrete facade. The boom arm, thick with rust, was undeniably down, blocking his path completely. He approached the barrier, his boots crunching on loose gravel. He tried to lift the boom arm, straining against its rusted weight. It wouldn't budge. It was impossibly heavy, as if rooted to the earth itself. This wasn't just an abandoned structure. This was a deliberate obstruction. The entity wasn't just making sounds in the cabin, it was twisting the very landscape, bending reality to its will. The road hadn't let him out, it had led into a cage, a dead end. The cabin wasn't merely a place where the pact had been made, it was the mechanism, the anchor. And the enduring vigilance, he realized with a horrifying clarity that stole his breath, wasn't a historical obligation for his ancestors. It was his. He wasn't just trapped in the cabin, he was now bound to it. The cabin was a living trap, and he was the latest addition to its collection. The true horror wasn't just the entity's presence, but its absolute control. He couldn't stay. Not another minute. The air itself felt thick with ancient agreements, with unseen eyes. A desperate surge of resolve stiffened his spine. He wasn't some sacrificial lamb, tied to a post. He would break the pact, or he would at least try to escape its reach. He moved with a frantic energy, snatching his worn satchel, stuffing a few essentials inside, a flashlight, a half-eaten energy bar, his car keys. The floorboards groaned beneath his hurried steps, a mournful complaint. A faint, cloying scent, like damp earth and aged paper, tightened its grip on the air. He burst through the front door, the hinges screaming in protest, and scrambled into his aging sedan. He slammed the gear into reverse, gravel spitting from beneath the tires as he spun the vehicle around, aiming for the narrow, overgrown track that led out of this accursed forest. The trees immediately closed in, their ancient branches forming a dense canopy that swallowed the feeble light of dusk. The familiar path seemed to twist and contort, its turns sharper, its dips deeper. He pressed the accelerator, determined, but the car felt sluggish, as if an invisible weight dragged at its chassis. The forest was no longer a natural boundary, it was a living, breathing labyrinth. The familiar moss-covered stones and gnarled roots that usually marked his way vanished, replaced by an endless, undulating wall of green and brown. He drove, the engine whining, the tires crunching over unseen debris, but the landscape remained stubbornly the same, towering pines, skeletal birches, and a suffocating quiet punctuated only by the car's labored breath. He'd driven this road countless times. How could it feel so utterly alien? He squinted through the windshield, the glass seeming to distort the already dim light, making the trees appear to sway with an unnatural, hypnotic rhythm. He gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles ached, his eyes darting from side to side, searching for any landmark, any sign that he wasn't simply driving in an endless, tightening circle. A sign, a structure. The border checkpoint. He pressed harder on the gas, the car lurching forward, the thrumming beneath him intensifying, growing into a low growl. He drove through the last fringe of trees, and there it was, a small, utilitarian booth, a weathered barrier arm, and a faded sign. A wave of immense relief washed over him, so potent it made his vision blur for a moment. He was out. He was finally out. He steered the car through the open barrier, expecting to see the asphalt of a main road, perhaps a glimpse of distant town lights. Instead, the road beyond the checkpoint was dirt, just like the one he'd been on. He glanced back in the rearview mirror, at the checkpoint booth. It was there, but the air around it shimmered faintly, like heat haze on a summer road, even though the temperature was dropping. The sign, he noticed now, was not just faded, but blurred, as if painted on water. This couldn't be right. He had passed through. He had seen the sign. He saw a familiar knot on a tree trunk, a cluster of peculiar fungus on a fallen log, markers he'd noticed hours ago, at the beginning of his escape attempt. His stomach churned. He pulled over abruptly, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust that settled like a shroud. He stumbled out of the car, his legs weak, and stared around him. The forest was identical. Utterly, sickeningly identical. He had driven for hours, through a border checkpoint, only to find himself here, back within the same endless, twisting labyrinth. The reveal hit him with the force of a physical blow. The entity's power wasn't confined to the cabin walls. It extended to the entire forest, twisting reality, making escape an illusion. He was trapped. Truly, utterly trapped. No signal. Of course. Only static. Reid. Reid. His breath hitched, turning into a ragged sob. He dropped the phone. His mind, already stretched thin, began to fray at the edges. He wasn't just lost, he was ensnared. The forest wasn't just woods, it was a cage, an extension of the cabin's malevolent will. He was utterly alone, surrounded by an unseen, inescapable presence that had patiently, inevitably, brought his back. Back to where it wanted him. Back to the cabin. His breath hitched, turning into a ragged sob. He dropped the phone. The damp earth, cold and unforgiving, met his knees with a dull thud. He wasn't just lost, he was ensnared. He sank deeper, the chill seeping through his jeans, a mirror of the cold dread curdling in his gut. Panic clawed at his throat, a raw, desperate sound. He pressed his palms into the mud, the gritty texture grounding him momentarily, but the earth itself felt alive, pulsing with a slow, malevolent rhythm. He couldn't stay like this, a broken thing dissolving into the forest floor. He started walking, not towards the cabin, not away from it, but deeper into the unfamiliar territory, drawn by a morbid curiosity, a compulsion that felt both his own and utterly alien. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp soil and something else, something ancient and metallic, like old blood mixed with iron ore. The canopy overhead seemed to knit tighter, swallowing the last vestiges of daylight, plunging the woods into a premature twilight. The path underfoot, if it could be called that, became indistinct, swallowed by gnarled roots and moss-covered stones. He stumbled, catching himself on a rough tree trunk, the bark scraping his palm. Then, through a sudden break in the dense foliage, he saw it. It stood stark against the deepening gloom, a decaying structure that defied the logic of the wilderness. A border checkpoint. Not a modern one, but something archaic, built of heavy, splintered timbers and rusted corrugated metal. A wooden barrier, half-rotted, hung precariously from one side, its chains long since eaten away by corrosion. A small, windowless hut leaned precariously, its roof caved in, choked with vines. There was no road leading to it, only the encroaching forest on either side. It was a gate to nowhere, or perhaps, a gate to somewhere else entirely. Reid approached cautiously, his boots crunching on fallen leaves and twigs. It pressed in on his ears, making them ring. He could hear his own heartbeat, a frantic drum against the backdrop of absolute quiet. He stepped over the fallen barrier, his hand brushing against the rough, splintered wood. It felt unnervingly dry, despite the pervasive dampness. As he passed through the threshold, a sudden, violent shudder racked his body. He saw. He understood. The entity was not a ghost in the conventional sense, not a lingering spirit. It was a hunger, a primal, ancient appetite born from a terrible desecration. Generations ago, his ancestors, desperate for protection or power, had sought to bind something. They hadn't understood the depth of the bargain. They had built the cabin not just on the burial ground, but as a lock, a cage around a force they believed they could control. A pact had been made, not with a benevolent spirit, but with a lingering, consuming force that drew sustenance from the land, from the very essence of life within its domain. The checkpoint, he realized with a sickening lurch, wasn't a physical barrier for people, but a symbolic one, a seal. It marked the boundary of the pact, the edge of the entity's immediate influence, beyond which it could not directly reach, but within which it was absolute. The revelation slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. The entity demanded not just a life, but the life. A descendant. A blood sacrifice, offered willingly or taken by force, to renew the pact, to feed the hunger, to maintain the fragile balance that kept it confined. His ancestor, the one who had died mysteriously, hadn't just been a victim, he had been the intended offering, a sacrifice that had gone awry, leaving the entity starved and enraged, its grasp now reaching for the next in line. Reid. His breath caught in his throat. It wanted his vitality, his very essence, to be woven into the fabric of its being, strengthening the ancient pact and perpetuating its existence. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about survival, its survival, at the cost of his bloodline. He stumbled back from the checkpoint, the information a lead weight in his skull. Not a growl, nor a shriek, but a low, guttural vibration that resonated deep in his bones, a sound of ancient, profound hunger. It was waiting. It had always been waiting. And now, it knew he knew. The cabin loomed, a jagged silhouette against the bruised twilight, not as a refuge, but as the maw of a beast. Reid, his breath misting in the frigid air, felt the familiar pull, the insidious tendrils of dread tightening around his resolve. He'd considered fleeing, pushing the old truck until the engine seized, driving past distant towns, past the last gas station, perhaps even imagining himself reaching a bustling border checkpoint, a place where the world felt ordered and safe, far removed from the primal scream of this forest. But the escape had never been real. The cabin had called his back, not with a whisper, but with a roar that echoed in his bones. He was here to end it. The porch groaned under his weight, the wood soft, almost spongy. A sickly sweet scent, like overripe fruit mingled with damp earth and something metallic, clung to the air. It was the smell of decay and consumption, the entity's breath. He pushed the heavy door open. It didn't creak, it sighed, a long, drawn-out exhalation. The air thickened, pressing down, making each breath a conscious effort. Dust motes danced in the anemic light filtering through grimy windows, not randomly, but in deliberate, swirling patterns that mimicked grotesque faces. The floorboards buckled beneath his boots, not from rot, but as if the very structure was alive, shifting, adjusting its weight. He saw it now, a faint, iridescent shimmer clinging to the corners of his vision, a pulsating haze that made the familiar furniture seem to ripple and breathe. He clutched the heavy, leather-bound journal to his chest, its brittle pages filled with the desperate scrawls of his ancestors. He'd spent days deciphering the fragmented entries, the coded warnings, the half-mad confessions. The pact wasn't just a promise of sacrifice, it was a ritual of severance, designed to isolate the chosen bloodline, to prune them from the healthy tree of humanity, making them easier prey. A low growl rumbled through the floor, vibrating up his legs. One of the old rocking chairs, a relic he remembered from childhood visits, began to rock rhythmically, slowly at first, then violently, as if an invisible, furious occupant struggled within it. "You thrive on isolation," Reid continued, forcing the words out, "on severing the ties." Frost bloomed on the window panes in intricate, fern-like patterns. The scent of ozone now joined the decay, hinting at something vast and elemental. It pulsed, a slow, deep beat that resonated with the rhythm of his own terrified heart. He knew his plan was a gamble. The journal spoke of an ancient counter-ritual, a way to reforge the broken connections, to reclaim the lineage from the entity's grasp. It required a symbolic act of reintegration, a public acknowledgement of the severed ties, performed within the heart of the pact itself. Reid moved towards the center of the room, towards the rough-hewn stone hearth that served as the cabin's anchor. He pulled out a small, tarnished silver locket from his pocket, a gift from a distant relative he barely remembered, one of the few tangible connections he had left to his scattered family tree. He also carried a small pouch of dried herbs, their scent a faint, earthy comfort against the growing horror. The entity shrieked, a sound that wasn't sound, but a vibration in his skull, a tearing at the fabric of his sanity. The walls began to weep, not water, but a thick, viscous black fluid that oozed from the cracks in the logs, smelling of crude oil and something utterly foul. The floorboards beneath him writhed, threatening to trip him. Always alone. You belong to me. He stumbled, nearly falling, but caught himself. No, he gasped, fighting for control. I'm not alone. Not anymore. This was the reveal. The pact wasn't just a curse for individual sacrifice, it was a curse of forced solitude. The entity's power grew not from the death itself, but from the deliberate, conscious severing of family bonds, from the desperate attempts of his ancestors to protect their loved ones by pushing them away, making them easy pickings. Each act of isolation, each secret kept, each relative estranged, fed the entity, strengthening the invisible chains that bound the bloodline. The true horror was not just the physical consumption, but the psychological fragmentation it inflicted, turning family against itself. The counter-ritual, therefore, was about reclaiming those connections, however symbolic. With trembling hands, Reid laid the locket on the hearthstone. He sprinkled the dried herbs around it, forming a rough circle. The black ooze from the walls began to seep towards his makeshift altar, bubbling, hissing as it neared the herbs. The estranged. The lost. I acknowledge our ties, unbroken by fear, unbroken by your hunger. He closed his eyes, picturing the faces he barely knew, the names whispered in hushed tones, the distant relatives he'd never met. He pictured his own parents, gone too soon, their lives perhaps cut short by this very pact, their isolation a tragic fulfillment of its design. The cabin roared. The very timbers groaned, twisting and splitting. A primal scream tore through the air, vibrating the very foundations. He felt his consciousness flicker, his mind screaming for oblivion. His nose began to bleed, a warm, metallic gush. But he held on. He held on to the image of the locket, the herbs, the names, the connections. He was making his stand, not just for himself, but for every single one of them. He would not be consumed. He would not be severed. The silence that followed the final, shuddering release was not a comforting balm, but a hollow, echoing void. Reid lay sprawled on the cabin's warped floorboards, the acrid scent of burnt wood and something far older, far fouler, clinging to his clothes, his hair, his very skin. His body throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, every muscle screaming in protest. The air, once thick with an oppressive, malevolent weight, now felt thin, almost brittle, as if the cabin itself had exhaled its last breath. He pushed himself up slowly, his limbs stiff, his head swimming. The cabin was a wreck. Yet, for all the physical destruction, it was the emptiness that truly struck him. He stumbled to his feet, his gaze sweeping the room. He was alive. He had survived. A tremor ran through him, not of fear, but of profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He reached for his face, his fingers brushing against stubble, a jagged cut above his eyebrow, and the rough, unfamiliar texture of dried tears. He hadn't even realized he was crying. The pact. The entity. The centuries of forced solitude, of families tearing themselves apart to protect what they loved, only to feed the very thing they sought to escape. He understood it now, the terrible, twisted logic. It wasn't about blood or death, it was about the severing, the deliberate sundering of human connection. And to break it, to truly banish the thing, he had understood, in those final, desperate moments, what he had to do. The cost. That was the reveal, the true, agonizing truth that now settled over him like a shroud. He had stood there, facing the raw, howling hunger of the entity, and he had made his choice. He had given it what it craved, not a life, not a bond severed through fear, but a bond severed for freedom. He had offered up the very capacity for deep, meaningful connection within himself. He had chosen to become an island, to truly be alone, so that no future generation would ever have to pay that price again. The faces of those he cared for, the warmth of their laughter, the comfort of their presence, they were still there in his memory, but the feeling associated with them, the emotional resonance, was muted, distant, like a photograph viewed through thick, distorting glass. He could recall the joy, the affection, the love, but he could no longer feel it with the same vibrant intensity. It was a cognitive understanding, not an emotional experience. He had sacrificed the very essence of human intimacy to starve the entity of its sustenance. He had traded his capacity for connection for his survival and the freedom of his lineage. The cabin might be quiet, but the horror had merely changed its dwelling, finding a new home within him. He gathered what few belongings he could salvage, his movements stiff and mechanical. He stepped out into the pre-dawn gloom, the forest air biting and fresh. The trees no longer seemed to writhe with unseen eyes, but their stillness felt heavy, watchful, as if they too were bearing witness to his profound, internal loss. Days blurred into a monotonous haze of driving. He avoided towns, sticking to desolate roads, fueled by stale coffee and a desperate need to put as much distance as possible between himself and that cabin, that forest. The world outside felt alien, too bright, too loud, too full of people he could no longer truly connect with. A uniformed official, his face impassive, peered at Reid through the smudged windshield. "Passport, please," the official said, his voice clipped and professional. Reid fumbled in his bag, his hands trembling slightly. He handed over the document, his eyes avoiding the official's gaze. He knew he looked like a ghost, gaunt, unshaven, his clothes stained and torn. He searched for the words, for a coherent explanation, but his mind felt like a tangled mess. Leaving, he finally managed, the single word hoarse and inadequate. The official raised an eyebrow, his gaze lingering on the cut above Reid's eye. "Everything all right, sir?" Reid met his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, he saw a flicker of concern, perhaps even pity. But it was a distant observation, like watching a scene unfold on a screen. He felt nothing, no urge to reassure, no inclination to confide. The words simply wouldn't come, and even if they did, he knew they would be meaningless. He simply shook his head, a slow, deliberate movement. Just leaving. The official held his gaze for another beat, then slowly handed back the passport. "Have a safe journey, sir." The words were standard. The tone held an edge of quiet apprehension, as if the official sensed the profound desolation radiating from Reid, a desolation that no simple border crossing could ever hope to contain. It was no longer in the cabin, it was in him. The passport, cool and impersonal, slid back into his hand, a flimsy barrier against the weight of his recent past. "Have a safe journey, sir." The words were a standard courtesy at the border checkpoint, yet they seemed to catch on the official's tongue, heavy with an unspoken understanding. Reid offered a curt nod, a practiced motion that felt utterly hollow, and pushed through the turnstile. The air on the other side was crisp, biting, but it lacked the oppressive, damp chill that had permeated every fiber of the cabin. He found his rental car exactly where he'd left it, a dull gray sedan waiting patiently, an unwitting witness to his escape. He slid behind the wheel, the plastic scent of the interior a jarring contrast to the rich, earthy decay that still clung to his clothes, a phantom aroma that would likely never truly leave him. The engine coughed to life, a reassuring rumble beneath his fingertips, and he pulled away from the border, the checkpoint receding in his rearview mirror like a forgotten photograph. Each mile he put between himself and the forgotten forest felt like a tenuous victory, a fragile thread pulled taut against an unseen force. He hadn't just inherited a property, he had stumbled into a generational responsibility, a grim stewardship over a ravenous hunger. The pact wasn't a bargain for peace, but a sustained feeding. The relative, whose sudden death had brought Reid to that cursed patch of earth, hadn't been a mere victim. He had been the latest offering, a conscious sacrifice to sate the entity, keeping its boundless appetite confined, preventing its tendrils from reaching beyond the ancient oaks. Reid's escape, his desperate refusal to become the next link in that chain, felt less like triumph and more like the ripping of an old, festering wound. He had broken the cycle. The entity was no longer contained by the bloodline's ritualistic offerings. The horror wasn't vanquished, it was merely free. He drove for hours, the monotonous drone of the highway a dull balm against the clamor in his skull. He found himself constantly checking the rearview mirror, not for other vehicles, but for something less tangible, a distortion in the reflection, a fleeting ripple in the fabric of the ordinary world. The ordeal had fundamentally altered him. The vibrant colors of the world seemed muted, its sounds sharper, yet less distinct. He felt the weight of history in the old buildings he passed, the silent stories embedded in the very earth. He was no longer just Reid, the architect, the man who designed clean lines and functional spaces. He stopped at a roadside diner, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the smell of stale coffee and fried food assaulting his senses. He ordered a black coffee, the bitterness a welcome jolt against the lingering phantom taste of damp earth and something acrid, almost metallic, on his tongue. He watched the other patrons. Their faces etched with mundane concerns, a tired truck driver, a young couple bickering over directions, a family laughing too loudly. Their obliviousness was a heavy cloak, a stark contrast to the thin veil of reality he now perceived. He envied them their ignorance, their simple worries. The horror wasn't something he had left behind in the cabin. It had become a part of him, an unwelcome passenger. He saw its potential everywhere now, in the unsettling stillness of a forgotten corner, in the sudden drop in temperature in an otherwise warm room, in the way a solitary crow watched him from a telephone wire, its gaze too intelligent, too knowing. And he had, inadvertently, woken it. He paid for his coffee and stepped back into the night. Nothing. Just the rustle of leaves in a faint breeze, the distant hum of traffic. Yet, the feeling persisted, a prickle of awareness that he was being watched, not by a single pair of eyes, but by something vast and diffuse, something that had finally broken its ancient chains.